when women fantasize about things, of course, they fantasize about what the ideal is, right? And we know that you don't always get everything in the same package. A lot of women, when they're looking at long-term mating, they're also looking at people who would be good long-term partners and good dads.
Have our preferences evolved with what we need?
One of the things that's useful to remember is that most of our psychological preferences, especially when it comes to mating, are adapted in some sense, or at least flexible to the environment that we actually live in. There are people who've done studies looking at women who were considered beautiful 50 years ago and women who are held up as beautiful today. And they still tend to have this particular curve to the lower part of their body, regardless of whether they're a 14 or a 2.
I know your research delves into male and female sexuality as expressed in pornography. What have been the most surprising insights that you've gained from studying these mediums?
One misconception that people sometimes have is that
how much do our traumas and or our upbringing shape our sexual preferences?
Oh, that's a good question. It's a big question to start out with.
Mhm.
I think that when we think about people's sexual preferences and when we think about people's behavior in general, right? Who we are is shaped by a number of different things, right? It's shaped by our genes, right? We inherit things from our parents that they don't really have much control over. But then there's also two or three sort of environmental aspects. One of them is the family environment, right? What we've grown up with, the cultural environment that we grew up with in the home. And then there's also, our peer environment, our juvenile peer environment. And to the extent that these things matter, many aspects of human behavior are shaped about half by genes and half by environment. So it would be surprising if some things that happen to us that we would see as being trauma or negative didn't have an effect. I don't think that they're necessarily always formative in terms of shaping people's sexual interests or sexual preferences. I do think there's a certain amount of truth to the idea that people are born that way, right? That some of people's preferences are with them from the moment that they pop out, even if they take a while to manifest. But I do think that certainly events and things that happen to people can make people consciously and unconsciously skew their behavior in one direction or another.
Okay, so let's say someone is very drawn to rough sex. Is that going to be telling to something that's maybe stored inside their body that they haven't let go of, and maybe they don't even want to, but could that maybe, shed some light on something internally?
It could. I will say that the majority of the research that I've seen looking at rough sex, just in terms of the question of who enjoys doing it, what do they say they get out of it, things like that, which is a lot of it is research that I've done with Becky Birch. The majority of people who engage in practices like rough sex do it because it's just something fun and different to try. Right. Part of it is that we engage in a lot of sexual behavior over the lifespan, and sometimes people just get bored and they want to try something different, and that sounds like something different and exciting. And so I think for some people that's the motivator, right, for engaging in that kind of behavior. It may also be that some people are higher risk takers. Right, they score high in what we often refer to in psychology as sensation seeking, right? And so they're looking for something extra, some extra edge, and they may enjoy other activities that have risk, like they may be the ones who think that jumping out of a perfectly good plane is a good idea, or doing a lot of backcountry skiing, or all sorts of other activities, exports. Those people might be a little bit more inclined to want to try things that might be a little bit edgy in their sexual life. There may be people who have issues of control, right? They either want to be in control or don't want to be in control. And that might be something that makes that kind of sexual activity more exciting and more appealing for them. I think the majority of people who do it don't necessarily do it because they're working through something. They're just doing it because it sounds interesting, and they're willing to try different things. And if it works for them, it works for them. Not everybody, a lot of people have tried it and don't continue to engage in those behaviors because they don't find them as arousing as other people do. And so I think, if somebody's into it, I don't think it's necessarily diagnostic of anything. But I do think that there probably are some people for which these behaviors may have been stimulated either by particular experiences they've had, whether they've been positive or negative, right? If you had an early sexual experience and it was really good, and you had a really good relationship with someone who was inclined more towards that behavior, then that might also make that behavior more appealing to you in general.
Mm, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What about when it comes to physical appearance?
Mm.
What do women prefer? I know that, lately the masculine is more skewed to slightly feminine, and maybe there's this more drastic difference between the hyper masculine and then the not.
I think it's a really interesting question. And I think, part of the problem is to analyze some of that stuff in the moment in terms of the current trends. It's really hard to know, because one of the things that we always worry about in studies where we ask people about, well, what do you think, or what do you like, or whatever, is whether they're answering honestly or they're answering because this is what's acceptable now or socially acceptable at any particular time. And so there's a number of different ways that we could look at like women's preferences, for example. If we're looking at what women find attractive in a man, and we're talking about the idea that women prefer men that are of varying levels of masculinity. If you look at the sort of fantasy material of women, or the kinds of actors or characters and things that they prefer, they do tend to still skew pretty masculine in many ways. You think about it's a good example. The kind of guys that get like voted sexiest guy of the year, right? The Chris Evans of the world, right? That a lot of women would find sexually attractive. They present as very masculine. They don't present as particularly necessarily hyper aggressive, but physically they present as highly masculine, as having athletic, fit bodies, and we can talk about whether that preference is driven by markers of health, or whether it's vigor, or whether it's masculinity, its ability to protect. There's probably a wide range of aspects of masculine bodies that make them attractive to women. I think that sometimes when we talk in the literature about there's the physical aspect of the man, that in terms of the masculineness of his appearance, but there's also the sort of psychological features, like, is he like a He-Man, Master of the Universe kind of guy, or does he have like a softer side? And I think that a lot of women, when they're looking at long-term mating, they're also looking at people who would be good long-term partners and good dads, right? And so you want masculine, a good protector, a good provider, but you don't want somebody who's dangerous to you and your own children, right? So there's a balance to be found there, I think, in terms of masculine aspects of masculine behavior and masculine bodies, I think.
Okay. Yeah. See, I'm curious because over time, maybe hundreds of years ago, you would find somebody that's, bulky and they could definitely protect you from a wild animal, but now we're not really in those situations. So does it tend to, then you have the men that have like startups, in San Francisco behind a computer all day, and they're a very good provider because, their money and their resources.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if over time, have our preferences evolved with what we need?
Yeah. I don't think they've changed as much as we sometimes like to think they have. In the general sense, I do think that again, if you went through generations and generations and generations of male physical prowess never mattering at all, then I think you would expect maybe to see some shifts, right? Especially if there were some advantages to traits that tended to go along with less masculine men. I think that some aspects of masculinity, like the competitiveness, that also leads to success when you do startups and things like that. That part clearly is still beneficial, regardless of what the physical sort of development of that individual is. Having a personality that involves that kind of drive for success is very appealing. I think that one of the things that's useful to remember is that most of our psychological preferences, especially when it comes to mating, are adapted in some sense, or at least flexible to the environment that we actually live in. So I suspect if you ask people who live in an environment where physical protection is still important, and there are some people who have data on this, like girls that grow up in an inner city environment, more aggressive men are actually more attractive because it actually makes a difference in that environment, maybe more than it would make if you grew up in Silicon Valley in a high-tech environment where maybe you're looking at ambition and mental skills, intelligence in a particular kind of way might be seen as most attractive, right? So I think there's probably variability in the extreme masculineness of male physiques, but some of the psychological aspects of masculinity, I think, are probably just as relevant today. And yeah, and so I think that when women fantasize about things, of course they fantasize about what the ideal is, right? And we know that you don't always get everything in the same package, and so the environment that you're in is going to influence what you prioritize. And maybe in some environments you're going to prioritize something like protection, and in another environment you might prioritize other kinds of skills that have to do with ambition that leads to success in those environments.
Fascinating. Okay. Yeah. Silicon Valley. That's what I was trying to think of. Yeah. I would imagine our environment and also what we see socially would influence that a lot. And what about the flip side? So men looking at women, because we're constantly being marketed a different ideal. So whether it's, the semaglutide thing, like just be really, really skinny, or we want curves, thick is in. And so it's like, there's also the side of that where it keeps us spending money because we're constantly, chasing what's in and what's hot. But also, do men have a preference there, or is it just us, following the marketing?
Yeah, I think for women, sometimes it's following the marketing. And I actually think there are also some other, maybe, I don't know, some female competition things that are driving that as well, that don't have anything to do with what men care about. When you think about some of the things women spend money on, certain aspects of fashion, expensive bags, for example, like, guys don't know whether it's real, it's fake, they don't care. But that's women competing, right, for each other, and that has status between women. I think that sometimes women may also pressure other women in ways that actually you might think, oh, well, she's saying it because she wants, I don't know, her friends to look better or feel better about themselves, and so they should lose weight. But maybe she wants them to lose so much weight that guys don't find them attractive anymore. Like there's a sort of a mean girl side to some of what goes on with women and what they tell other women they need to do in terms of their looks. In terms of what men actually themselves prefer, obviously there's some individual differences between men, just like there are some individual differences between women, and there are men who have particular preferences. But in general, men cross-culturally prefer women who basically have the appearance of being young and fertile, right? So traits that would have led to reproductive success, in the ancestral past, mating with women who can reproduce. And in general, that is young women, right? As women get older, they're not, reproductive. When you get to my age, that's not something that's happening. But when you're younger, right, that there are physical features that are associated with youth that men find attractive, right? And they have to do with the quality of the skin, the quality of the hair, the shape of the body, right? I mean, your body looks different before you've had children than it looks after you've had children. And many of the features that men consider ideal are features that are reproductive, quality markers, if you want to think about it in that kind of a scientific term. So having a curvier figure, although not necessarily, I mean, we do focus a lot on breasts, especially in the US, and that the shape seems to be more relevant to men than maybe the overall size. There are some studies out there suggesting that perky breasts, regardless of size, are what's considered attractive, which again is associated with youth, right? But that the shape of the body having a relatively small waist in comparison with the hips, sort of regardless of whether the person is thinner or heavier, is something that's considered attractive. And that's partially, from a biological standpoint, relevant to the fact that where you put your fat when you're a female has a lot to do with your hormones and your fertility and your reproductive ability and your like the quality of your offspring. There's some studies suggesting that female butt and hip fat is associated with intelligence in their offspring. So I think that men's preferences for female shape have a lot more to do with fertility markers in youth than much else, and they can get moved around by fashion, but that curviness doesn't seem to get moved around. And there are people who've done studies looking at women who were considered beautiful 50 years ago and women who are held up as beautiful today, and they still tend to have this particular curve to the lower part of their body, regardless of whether they're a 14 or a 2. For women's clothes. And I think that actually, if you think about it, and think about it in terms of two industries that focus a lot on female bodies, you think about the pornography industry and you think about the fashion industry. Women in the fashion industry are very slender. They have to be to make those clothes work. The fashion industry has a lot of influence from women and from gay men, and I think it shapes the way that the bodies look. But when you look at porn, which is really something men look at for particular purposes, the women are much curvier, right? It is not a focus on really stick thin bodies, because for most men that's not what they associate with sexual attraction.
Yes. Okay. On that subject and bringing up breast augmentation, I remember when boob jobs started becoming very popular. That's what a lot of 18-year-olds were getting as graduation gifts from their parents. And around that time, I remember hearing, different guys saying, oh, like she's built for speed, not for comfort, things like that. And so maybe is there a preference regarding whether you're looking at a woman for just an interest of sex or girlfriend, wife material, and do breasts play a role in that, or like fake breasts, or like how you're saying in pornography, the curvier versus,
Yeah. So most of the research on men's preferences in terms of their difference between sort of whether they're looking for a long-term partner or short-term don't surprisingly don't show that much difference. In general, men find attractive what they find attractive. It's just if they're looking just for short-term, they're just a little bit less picky, I guess, in a sense. I do think that there are some cultural factors that drive preferences probably for breast size, but I think some of it is also that it may be because in general, if you ask, like say you ask like a couple thousand people, men, just gave them pictures of breasts and asked them which ones they found most attractive in terms of size, they do tend to pick, I think the average tends to be more towards the sort of fuller C to a D cup. It's not like Dolly Parton size max, but it's also not a more boyish sort of flatter figure either. And it may be that part of the appeal of that kind of size is that it reveals age better, because a 17 or 18-year-old with size C or D cup breasts will have perky large breasts, but when she's 40, those won't be perky unless they're fake. But if you're so that's, I guess, an advantage of being that kind of size when you're young, and a disadvantage of it when you're older. If you're smaller breasted, actually, there's an advantage in a sense as you get older, because they stay perky longer, even though they may, not be as eye-catching to all guys at a younger age. So if there is an advantage to having larger breasts in terms of what men find attractive, it's, I think, largely influenced by how much it reveals about fertility status, and how much it might, because of course it's still a post-pubertal signal, right? So how much is revealing about that, and how much it might be revealing about age and health by the shape. But I do think that because there is an emphasis on that, and certainly in porn there's obviously an emphasis on that. There are more women with larger breasts than smaller breasts. And it is something that's a visible sign of femininity. Many women are anxious if they're not larger breasted, or at least if they're not, if they're particularly smaller breasted. And I think that's part of what's fueling, the breast augmentation industry. I think it's fueled by two things in many ways. One is this sort of feeling like I will be more feminine and more attractive to men if they're larger and firmer, but also, as women get older, right, and some women get divorced, right, and they're on the market again, they're worried about the shape, and so they want lifts and implants because they want to look like their breasts look when they were 20, when they're 50.
Okay, I want to dive into pornography, but I would like to preface this by just saying that I have an overall general disapproval of it because of the dark energy that's behind it. And, I actually, in my late teens, spent some time working in gentlemen's clubs, and I have I had a little bit of life happenings in that area, but I find it fascinating and very interesting. And I know your research delves into male and female sexuality as expressed in pornography and other erotic genres. So I'd like to know what have been the most surprising insights that you've gained from studying these mediums.
Most surprising. I'm not sure. I guess there have been individual small things that I found surprising, I guess, that I still would like maybe answers to, I guess, in a sense. I guess one thing that other people might find surprising, I suppose, one particular feature of pornography that is largely aimed at a male audience is the popularity of external ejaculations. Whether the guy is ejaculating on his female partner's face or on her body or whatever. It's also very common in gay pornography. It's not just that you see it in heterosexual pornography. But for a long time, people said that this was a piece of evidence that suggested that pornography was really about objectifying women or degrading women. Like it was suggesting that act was designed for that purpose. And one of my colleagues, Jessica Heeman, and I did a couple different studies, including one that is going to be, it was just recently accepted, that's going to be published, I think, actually maybe online now, but it'll be published early next year in the Journal of Archives of Sexual Behavior. But we were looking cross-culturally at this, testing the idea that people who actually like degrading other people, or who have very sort of psychopathic or Machiavellian tendencies, would then, if that was the case, then you might expect they'd be the most likely to like those kinds of images. And we actually found that was not the case. Actually, people who have more negative views of women, or who have more sort of Machiavellian approaches to people, don't seem to be any more fond of those kinds of images. And in general, people men anyways, score the how much they enjoy those images in things sort of in the low moderate to sort of low high kind of thing, and many people don't like them, right? So it's kind of an interesting puzzle still as to why they are so common when many people do not seem to find them to be extremely appealing, although interestingly in our study gay men found them the most appealing, which I thought was also kind of interesting. So to me, I guess some of those kinds of things are surprising, I suppose. I think they might be surprising to some other people. The thing that I suppose in some sense is the least surprising to me, but sometimes does surprise other people, is that, pornography and then erotic genres for women are so different as to be like alien species at times. They can both be really explicit. Like when you read women's erotic literature, it can sometimes be incredibly explicit, verbal descriptions of the exact same things that you would watch in pornography. However, they're usually tempered with some emotional connection or relevance to the activity. And that's one of the things that characterizes the difference between them. But it definitely, in a sense, didn't surprise me coming from my research background, which is like, men and women were shaped by different needs in the sort of reproductive realm. But I think it often surprises other people because they think that, well, women are so much more sophisticated and free about their sexuality now, they should just enjoy the same porn as men. And in general, they don't. And when women do watch porn, if you look at like Pornhub's data on pornography consumption, for example, first of all, Americans are not the group that has the largest proportion of women who watch pornography. Currently, it seems to be the Philippines that have the largest proportion of women consuming porn, which is interesting and raises interesting questions about why that might be the case. But they tend to look for different things in their porn. They're not looking necessarily for the exact same kind of search terms. They're not looking for the exact same types of people. And again, that isn't surprising if you come from a place that men and women are different. But these days, there's a lot of maybe they're not that different. And so sometimes people are surprised by that.
How does watching porn affect the individual's own sex life?
I think it can, there's a variety of different ways in which it can affect that. I don't personally study that. I've read a lot of the research on that, and for people who are interested in it, I think Chris Ferguson's got some really interesting stuff on that. I think there are a couple ways in which it can influence people. I think that for some people, it actually influences it in a positive way. They try things they wouldn't have tried otherwise. And it actually, if they talk to their partner about it, and maybe even they watch some stuff together, it actually is a good thing for their sex life to do that. I think that it can be problematic in relationships when somebody is watching instead of communicating with their partner, or they're using it as a crutch because their sexual relationship is poor, and then they don't work on it because they just do this instead. I think using it as a crutch is probably not a good thing. Using it as a exploratory tool is maybe a good thing. I think that the data suggesting that it increases violence suggests that that's not the case. The majority of the research now suggests that that's not really the problem. It's not that it makes men not like women. I do think that if you only expose yourself to beautiful women, that might make you think your partner is a little bit less attractive. I don't think that porn is the only problem with that. I think that if you just only watched Hollywood movies, like I think where you live and where you work probably also play a role in how high your standards are for what you think attractiveness should be. I think that people who live in Los Angeles probably have a different standard than people who live in other parts of the world because they're overexposed to industries that only have attractive people in them. So I think that it can have effects in that sense. I think it can have, if you are interested in things that are atypical, I think that could be a beneficial thing to do because you could explore it without necessarily having to explore it with a partner who might or might not be interested in your atypical interests. And it can make you feel like that they're okay. And I think that's probably good for people and good for their sense of self and their sense of self-esteem. To the fact that it normalizes some behaviors that could be problematic. It depends how much input you get from the rest of your environment versus porn. So I mean, when people talk about children getting exposed to it, I'm like, people should actually talk more about sex in a general sense with young people, so that they're not only getting their lessons from their peers or porn or whatever, because like any commercial product, it's not supposed to be real. In that sense, any more than watching The Boys or Game of Thrones or any other television show is supposed to be real in that sense, right? So, to me, I think that there can be positives and negatives of consuming it, and I think that consuming it as a occasional kind of thing, or even as a semi-regular thing, is probably not problematic, as long as it's not the only exposure you're having to information about sex.
I never thought of it as being something that's not real, but that's such a good point. It's kind of like wrestling.
Yeah, I mean, it's real to the extent that there's real people engaging in real activities, and some people do engage in all of the activities that we see here, but it is still a performance. Right. In the same way that television is a performance, that professional wrestling is a performance, that all sorts of things are performances of something that people do in their actual lives. And so to the extent, watching things like that, it tends to give you an exaggerated view of some things, right? In the same way that if all you ever did was watch Twilight, that would give you a skewed version of what men and women's relationships tend to be like as well, right? I mean, I think that to some extent, all of the media production stuff that's commercial is designed to tap into certain aspects of our human nature that make products really successful. But we shouldn't assume that they are the reality.
Mm-hmm. I have a friend who dated someone who was addicted to porn. I mean, I know he watched it every day. I'm not sure how often. And it bled into their relationship in different ways. So they would do role play, and she felt like she had to kind of live up to this and bring that novelty. So she would, dress up as different things, or even try to be different people from what he watched. And it even, I don't know if you ever heard of this, but they have the VR headsets where you could put it on and watch something, and they had it for porn. I mean, I'm sure it's obviously, but so he would wear that and be watching someone else while they're engaged. So it created a disconnect.
Yeah, I mean, that would be, I would imagine that would be incredibly off-putting, right? Because most people, the whole point is you want the sexual connection, especially for women, right, with the particular person. And so I imagine that's not a good thing. I mean, I don't know that I think that the role play thing in and of itself, if it's an occasional thing, is anything that's really an issue anyways, in the sense that there's lots of people who do stuff like that. I mean, I went to Star Trek conventions when I was a child. I was a big fan of Star Trek. Would go to like conventions. I can remember going to one when I was a teenager, and there were people who were dressed up, as characters from the show. And there was like a couple it was a guy and a girl, and they were dressed up like Klingons from the show. And they were all like, engaging in public displays of affection and stuff like that in costume, right? And so to the extent that could be something that's fun for people as part of a way to spice up a relationship or just make things different, I don't think that that's a problem. If the other partner, though, doesn't like it or doesn't enjoy it, that is a problem, right? I mean, I do think that there are challenges to people who are engaged in relationships with people who don't have similar interests or preferences for things like that. And I would imagine that if you didn't have a willingness to do that, then that's not a good long-term partner, because that person might have been that way and might have liked doing things like that regardless of it. Like like if that person wasn't into porn, but they were into sci-fi, they might have been asking them to dress up as all sorts of characters from different things anyways, you know, and do that. Because part of that, I think, is just sensation seeking and novelty seeking. And you know, it's kind of like this, the sex advice for couples who've married like for 30 years and they're kind of bored with things. And people say, well, you know, change it up, have sex in a different place. Don't always have sex in the same position, you know, try different, you know, things. And so for some people, that's going to be really important. Now, if you haven't been in a relationship for very long and that's happening, that's probably not a good sign if you're not both into changing things up, because it means that you're mismatched maybe on your sensation seeking, and that you may always find that to be a struggle.
Have you found that women are more demisexual and sapiosexual versus men?
I've not really looked at that in men particularly. I think that in general, women, even if they find someone physically attractive, they often need more of a connection, right? Especially for, you know, long-term relationships, right? And that makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Women are the ones who get pregnant. Women are the ones who are obligated to put in that much investment into a child. And they're the ones stuck breastfeeding historically. And even today, they're the ones doing that kind of thing. And so I think that they care a lot more about things other than just how attractive the guy looks, and things other than whether or not he can provide. There are all of the other things that are, is he going to be a good dad? Is he going to stick around? Is he going to do all this stuff? So I think that for many women, being attracted to the person is a really integral part of being attracted to the outside as well. And so I think for women, it's more complicated. I'm trying to remember, there was a book that was written, it was a number of years ago. There was just two women, I think, that wrote it. And they talked about women's sexual psychology as being Miss Marple's detective agency, that there's all this information that you want, right, before you really decide that this is what somebody you want to have sex with. And that for men, it was like Elmer Fudd from the old cartoons. You just point and shoot. I think is a little unfair to men, but there is also an element of truth in the fact that the systems work a little bit differently. And I think that for women, there's just a lot more going on.
What are some common misconceptions or controversies surrounding your research on sexuality?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think that nobody ever, I will say that in general, I don't find that, you know, people at conferences come up to me and say things like, I don't agree with what you found or something. You know, people will disagree with the interpretation sometimes, right? Okay. But they don't come up and say, I don't believe that people, you know, like that or get off to that or whatever. I think that one misconception that people sometimes have is that that when we talk about men and women being different, we mean all men are this way and all women are that way. And it's like almost every trait that males and females have, there's like a bell curve, right? Like there's some people are low, some people are high, most people are in the middle. And so there are some women whose sexuality is going to be much more similar to male sexuality and the sexual psychology, and there's going to be men who are, you know, more feminine in their sexual psychology. And so I think that's one thing that sometimes people will say, well, you're saying all men are like this and all women are like this. We're saying, no, on average, this is what shapes men. And this is why so many would be this way, and the same for women. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people at the tail ends, right? It's like when people say, well, you know, the implication of saying stuff like this about female sexuality is that all women just want to, you know, have babies or something and not work or do whatever. And it's like, you know, no, not all women. I mean, lots of women, what I will say is most women have a nurturing tendency, but they don't necessarily always want to have children. right? So we are talking earlier about the kitten that's running around my house trying to distract me while I'm doing things. That is where my nurturing goes to. It goes to like the pets, right? I never particularly wanted children. I adore my nephew. He's fabulous. My pets are fabulous. So there's variation in women. And then there are other women who, like, if they can't have a ton of children, they're going to be really unhappy, right? So just saying that in general women are this way and in general men are this way is not to say that you can assume that about any particular man or particular women. It's just telling you in general, these are what these groups are like. And so I think that can sometimes be like a misconception, is that we're saying all men are going to watch porn and all men want this type of woman and whatever. I think that that's, there are individual differences, like experiences, that shape people's preferences, right? If your first girlfriend was not conventionally the most attractive girl, but you may have, like, that may be what really gets you excited. It was your first experience. It was so formative for you. And that may be the kind of girl that you always like, so it's not to say that there's not variation, but it is to say that there are certainly factors that shape it. And I guess maybe one thing that can sometimes be, other people will sometimes see as being a controversial thing, is I don't think any of it is about what men or women should be like, right? I'm interested in explaining why we behave the way that we do. I'm not interested in telling people how they should behave or how they should live their life. I think that if men and women in general understood each other better, they might get along better. But that doesn't mean that you should always put up with everything from the opposite sex if it's not something that that works for you. I think relationships are compromised, and I think people need to work that out. But sometimes people are saying you're excusing one group of men or women's behavior, and it's like, it's not really about that. It's just, why are we this way? Because I don't think it's just that, it's not just Barbie's fault or the media's fault or whatever. There's a wide range of things that have shaped us, and if we don't understand them, if we do want to change our behavior, where are we supposed to start? Because we don't really know what's shaping it. And so I don't do research on things like rape or sexual assault, but I know people who do. And sometimes people will be quite aggressive when they're trying to explain the behavior, because they're saying explaining it justifies it. And it doesn't. But if you can't explain it, how do you expect to stop it? Right. I mean, it really does leave you with a problem if at some level the behavior is undesirable. And so for me, understanding sexuality and male and female sexuality, in the end, it should help people work better as couples if they understand each other better, and if they actually can openly communicate about that, which that has a lot more to do with societal views about what is acceptable to talk about, how much we encourage people to talk about sex. I mean, when I teach this stuff, I have students in my class who can't even, like, they're college students. They should be able to talk about it in class, and they really are comfortable. Other students, they will tell you more than you want to know in class. And I'm like, I didn't really need to know that much about my students. But I think that we do need to do more to encourage that, because, if we want to encourage particular types of behavior, we have to encourage people to be willing to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. And 100%, if we need to understand ourselves and other people, that's the whole, point of I feel like researching this and getting to know all of our preferences, because you can't even change or optimize yourself if you don't understand yourself, and it helps you to understand others when you do understand yourself. And you said something that made me think of another question about preferences when it comes to how people look. You mentioned, maybe you had a first girlfriend and now you are drawn to other women who look like that. Okay, what about your parents? Because you hear, oh, you always like date your dad, or your mom, or whatever.
I don't know. So I don't really think most people are attracted to people who look that much like their parents or their siblings or anything either, because I do think that, like most animal species, we try to avoid incest, right? Because inbreeding is bad from a biological standpoint, and of course we have all sorts of moral reasons for thinking it's bad. But I think that the psychological traits that we saw as being very positive in our parents, we do often look for, right? So, or look for the opposite, right? So I think that if you grew up in a very secure home with good dad, good mom, you may look for traits that were similar to that in your partner, because you've got a model for what works in a relationship that you're working off of, and for traits that you might see as appealing. And so to that extent, I think people may often look for more personality-based traits in the people that they go into relationships with, if they had positive parent-offspring relationships. I think if you had the opposite, or you were lacking them, you may look for the exact opposite, right? I mean, if you had, or you may be more willing to put up sometimes with certain things, right? Like you hear that from girls who grew up in homes where a parent was abusive, that they carry on that behavior because that's what they've learned in terms of how relationships work. I think that probably the early environment, you probably are attracted to things that are quite different from that, just as a way of avoiding incest. The sort of research on that for humans is that physical resemblance and to you or to your parents, probably more even to your parents, physical resemblance tends to be discouraging of sexual attraction. And again, sort of people who look like people that you were raised with very similarly, not something that's attractive. But that could also even extend to things like kids in your neighborhood, right? That there's a certain amount of like outbreeding that is actually what we find more attractive. And so I don't think of it so much in terms of the physical appearance, but I do think that if you've had really positive relationships, you're probably going to look for partners who are similar in those things, because those are traits that you see as being positive, right? So somebody who has a really nurturing, like a guy with a really nurturing mom, is probably also going to look for that in their sexual partners. For guys, that might not be the first thing they look for, but that's going to be the thing that they look for after what they find physically attractive.
Interesting. See, I feel like I guess I'll use myself as an example. I feel like I've dated in the past, before I did a lot of my own internal healing, and like looking back, I feel like the qualities that those men had possessed things that or the qualities were things that maybe did come from my parents that were unhealed, that I needed to heal. So it was like a mirror and once that was healed, now I'm no longer attracted to or attracting those types of men with those qualities.
So more like you had some negative experiences and then we're looking for the same sort of thing to change something about it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So let's say anger was a thing with one of my parents, so then I would attract somebody who had that same anger in them. And I don't know if it was a cycle that I needed to break, or if it was showing me something that was inside of me that I needed to address.
And it may be that some people, if you grow up in an environment where you're used to being treated a certain way or having certain kind of behavior, you may be more accepting of it, and then that may attract other people who are like that to you, and then you have to get to a point where you recognize, right, that this is dysfunctional or bad for you, and then you get that growth and move out of the relationship, right? And so it may not even be that people are looking for those people, but that they are attracting those people, or at least they're giving a sign that they'll put up with those people. And so you can think about that in terms of like somebody who has, like, say, for example, like an absent father, right? And then they put up with husbands that are, or boyfriends that are less attentive than they should be, right? Or something like that. Until the point that they finally may, and some women may never get to that point, but some women are going to get to a point where they're going to be like, this is some dumb shit. I'm not putting up with this anymore. And I'm just going to walk away from this. But I don't think it has much to do with the physical appearance. I think it has a lot to do with, as you say, it's the psychological characteristics of the relationship more than
Brown hair.
someone who looks like dad or looks like mom or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
It's a familiar feeling. I feel like, if
well, it might be comfortable, even though it's not a positive, right? Because it's something that you're used to. Exactly. And I think that again, it's like, if you've learned a certain pattern of behavior with somebody who has particular traits, then it's easy to just start replicating that with another person with those same traits, rather than something really different with somebody who's going to be really different.
Mm-hmm.
And that takes more maturity to be willing to do the change, right? Because change is often a bit uncomfortable for many people. It's better often, right? You grow from those experiences. And so I think once you've reached a certain point that you can recognize that, that's when people are going to break those kinds of cycles of being in, of having learned particular relationship dynamics in the home that are not actually healthy ones.
Right. Yes. And becoming self-aware.
Yeah. I think when I think about that question, I think about it more like in the sense, I think, again, it probably comes from like own experiences, right? Like I had very functional parents, like that stayed married forever and stuff like that. And were very into the whole childcare thing. And so, I think I would probably I've always held partners to a fairly high standard in terms of what I expect of their behavior. But none of them have been very similar in physical appearance in that sense. But they've always had to be very smart and very well behaved, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there anything that we haven't covered today that you think is worth mentioning?
The one thing that I think I would sort of reiterate is that, a lot of times today, whether we're talking about relationships or whether we're talking about like women's self-image and how it's influenced by things around them, there's an awful lot of blame often placed on men, whether it's like, okay, it's men consuming porn or it's men demanding a standard of attractiveness. But women actually have a much higher standard of attractiveness for women than men do. And, it's like women will worry about 1 pound and a wrinkle here, and the guy doesn't have a clue, right? It's just irrelevant. And so I think, my advice for women is that, you shouldn't overthink and over worry about those little details, because if you're worried about them because you're worried about how attractive your partner finds you, or you're looking for a new partner and you're worried about it, you're going to be far more scrutinizing of your faults than any guy is when it comes to those kinds of things. And if you have really good, well-trusted girlfriends, that's great. But a lot of your female friends may not always have your best interests at heart when they say, you'd look great if you took this drug that makes you look like you had all the moisture sucked out of your body. Right? Like, it's like you don't want to lose so much weight that you have to fill your face full of fillers to look like a normal face. And so I think that we sometimes, in our quest to attribute blame for certain things to the media or to men or whatever, we forget that women are also a big factor in this. And so, I would just encourage people to be less critical of small things, and to be, open to conversation about stuff in general in the relationships.
We can't keep blaming the men for everything.
Yeah, they're men. I mean, and you can figure them out, but they're not as discriminating as women, like in that sense. Women are far harsher critics of women, and you can see it online every day, far harsher critics of women than men ever will be. And I think it's useful for us to keep it in mind, both in terms of our own self-criticism and how other women interact with us.
I have one final question I ask everyone at the end, and it is around health, because we do focus on health and wellness on this podcast. So what is your number one health tip? So whether that's diet, mindset, emotional, physical, just the one piece of advice you would like everyone to know.
I'm going to give you two, because they're kind of different. One is informed by my recent experiences, and the other one is a general thing. Try to keep your stress levels as low as possible. I know that's a hard thing to do, whether it's exercise, whether it's meditation, whatever it is. Try to do that, because stress is so tough on your body. The other thing is that as women get older, less carbs. I have found as I've gotten older that I am much healthier than I was 10 years ago, but I eat a non-processed, higher protein diet now. And it has really made a big difference for me. So I don't feel the urge to take any weird drugs that might or might not be good for me in the long run. But I think that and exercise are the things that, and also because exercise is helpful for stress, I think those are some of the most useful things for people, and especially for women as they get older. If you're fit, if you exercise and you try and keep your life as low stress as possible, I think you will have a healthier, happier second half of your life.
I'd have to agree with you on both of those points. I've found the same.
Yeah.
Katrin, Salmon, this has been an absolute pleasure. Where can people go to learn more, find more from you?
Well, okay. The easiest way is probably to go to my university's webpage. And so if you go to even just to www.redlands.edu and then just put my name in the search box, it will pop up with information about me and my webpage and my work. And anybody who has questions can always contact me at my email, which is Katrin_Salmon@redlands.edu.
Great. And that will all be in the description. Thank you again so much. And thank you everyone for listening.